our final stages of our op art design. So now we're going to talk about contrast and patterns. So contrast shows a difference. The highest contrast is black and white, of course, because there's nothing much more different than black against white. Contrast can occur in many levels. It can be a very high contrast, like my example of black and white, or it can be very low contrast, say light gray beside a gray that's slightly darker. Pattern contrast can occur in many ways also. So one way in which pattern contrast can occur is straight line patterns up against curved line patterns, or circular patterns up against square patterns. You can also show contrast through thickness of lines. So remember, with this one we use the ultrafine Sharpie to trace our design. But if I also take the fine Sharpie, it's a thicker marker, and if I trace over one of these lines, I can show contrast through the thickness of line also. So these are things I want to think about when I'm on my final stages here of my design. Now I'm not going to put the designs directly on here at first. I am going to use my practice copy. So I can either use my big 12 by 12 or I can use my small 6 by 6, and I do like to use this one just because it's not as much paper to have to handle and maneuver. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to think of ways I can fill up some of these spaces, some of these shapes and spaces that my design created with pattern. Now, if you're not sure what type of patterns you can use, or you're having trouble thinking of patterns, I'm uploading a handout similar to this, in which it comes from a book called Zentangle, and it shows you ways in which you can make patterns. So remember, pattern is a repetition of something. So whether it's a repetition of a shape or a repetition of a line, it is a repeating item. So as I look through here, and if I kind of like this pattern here, I can then follow the instructions here. So since I like this pattern, I might use it on here. And I'm just going to try to figure out now where I would like this pattern. So maybe I'm going to put it here in my middle. Now instead of designing, and I'm getting rid of my little B there, instead of designing the whole entire section, since I am talking about mirror reflection a lot and radial balance, I'm going to design just this part of this inner space, the one triangle. So looking at my pattern here, I see it starts out by applying rows of circles. And the rows seem to be one above the other. So I wouldn't have space there. I might see a little bit of one sticking out here. And so I'm trying to imagine spacing on this. So if I made one here, here. So this next row down, I should be able to get another layer over here. And again, it's okay to have parts where our patterns come off of our design. And I look at the next step, and it connects it with some vertical lines, and they use a double line. So I'm drawing two lines, connecting my dots. And the nice thing about patterns and ones that you may find, like I looked here in this packet for, is that you don't have to follow them exactly. So after I put in these lines, if I kind of like the look of the pattern, I could stop and just use it. I'm going to go ahead and put in the crossover part just because I didn't get a lot of circles on here, and I just want to fill up some more space. And I think maybe I'll go ahead and squeeze in another circle down here. Okay. Now if I like this, I'm going to keep it and I'm going to make it darker. If I don't like it, I can erase it, try something else in there. So I'm going to go ahead and keep it for now. So I'm going to need my graphite paper again, and I'm going to open up my square, and now I'm going to do like we've done before, in which I'm going to trace over my lines very heavily. And as we know, I'm creating fresh graphite, dark graphite for tracing and copying to my other side. And I'm creating that ghost image copy on the back. So this is also the time in that some of my lines were a little bit thin. I'm bulking them up, making a little bit more space between them. And so even though I have that lighter version of them. So as you can see, I'm tracing these over, and as I am doing this, I am tracing over to make them darker. And any corrections. Some of my lines were a little bit thin, so I made them a little thicker. So I have my ghost image on the back. I have fresh graphite here. So the next step is to fold this over to this side and trace over my ghost lines. Okay. So when I open it, I now have my ghost image on the other side, and I would of course put fresh graphite on both sides. Then this way it will be ready to start tracing. There I noticed a line I forgot originally while tracing. So I'm copying it on. And make sure I get that reflected over. And then when I trace over this one, remember to put my graphite paper in behind so I get my ghost image. There you can see my design, mirror reflecting. Okay, so now that I have my mirror reflection, fresh graphite on both sides, I can then take this and my large 12 by 12, remember this is the one that is unfolded, traced in ultrafine Sharpie already, and I can lay this down onto my square, line up my patterns, and once I have that lined up, then I can start tracing this pattern over. So again, I'm going to press heavy. Again, if I accidentally go off my design, remember that's okay. Nothing's transferring over unless there's graphite under there. Okay, so I once again peek under, make sure I got all of my parts. So it is there. So now what I do is, since this side has all that fresh graphite, just like when we created our design originally onto the 12 by 12 paper that was folded, I'm going to take this, flip that fresh graphite over and down. I'm going to line up my patterns and my design, and I'm going to once again trace. And now that I have that one traced, I will once again take this, flip it over. Now I should have checked. I did forget to peek under there and check. So please do make sure you do that. And I'd lay this down and I'd again trace over this, to make my copies. So once I have that filled up, then I'll go to the Sharpie marker, and I start with the ultra fine again, and I will trace over this design and make it dark with the ultra Sharpie marker. Once I have it all traced, then I will move on to another part of my design. So I am requiring that you have at least 3 patterns in your op art. So this would be one pattern. So then I would decide where I would want a second pattern and what type of pattern do I want. How much space am I going to use up? Do I want a very open pattern? Do I want something that uses bigger shapes that are closer together so that the pattern then fills up more of an area? And I can start thinking ahead, even though I'm not coloring anything in right now with my Sharpie. I can start thinking about, well, maybe I want to pick some patterns like this one down below here in the book, where the shapes are colored in compared to the one I picked up here where the lines are colored in. Notice this one looks more dark. This one is not as dark because this one has more dark Sharpie being used. I'm going to show you an example of what I've already done with one of these. So here's my little 12 by 12. Notice there's some little pieces of tape on it because I did carefully tape it to my design when I was tracing this. And you can see here I have 1, 2, 3, 4 patterns on here. This is what it looked like when I first drew it, just the outlines of the patterns. Okay, bring that up closer to you. What I then did on one side after I traced my patterns on was I took pencil and I kind of colored in things, trying to decide where I'd like it darker and where I'd like it lighter. So you can see here I decided I was going to try coloring in around the circles. I colored in between. This is a basket weave pattern, so I colored in between the different weavings. And up here I colored in parts of the little squares I put inside the bigger squares. And this is my finished copy. So this is your last task. You need to think about contrast, where you're going to have very dark areas, where you're going to have areas that aren't quite as dark. How are you going to use pattern to show contrast? So here where it's straight lines with slight curved line pattern up against a polka dotted pattern, and then I come out here to a grid pattern with little squares in it, and then a grid pattern without any squares in it right beside it. You can see also here where I used the fine tip Sharpie to create a thicker line compared to the ultra fine line, which is right beside it. And then once I had it all traced on and all of the Sharpie applied, I then went back in and did the coloring. So once I had this pattern traced on, I came in and carefully colored. Now I made a decision here, because I had some black areas that would be colored in this pattern. I could have colored this whole thing black, but notice I left a little bit of a white line here. And then since I put it on the inside, I decided to try it on the outside. I ended up liking it, so I kept it. But I could have colored clear to my original ultra fine line in the outside there. So now you're down to the final stages, making choices, deciding what types of patterns you'll use, how you'll create contrast, and what areas and shapes you'll color in. In the end, you'll have your finished op art design.